Thanks so much for tuning in to Reversing Climate Change. I'm the host, Ross Kenyon. We have two sponsors right now, Rainbow and Philip Lee LLP. If you give me a couple minutes, I'll tell you about why they are very relevant to your interests. So listen up. If you follow me on Substack or LinkedIn, you've probably seen me write for Rainbow recently. They have a very idiosyncratic approach to how science is commercialized and how engineering works within carbon removal. And I really like working with them. I've learned a lot from the people there. They're very smart, thoughtful people, and they're aiming to be the most developer-centric registry out there. What's cool about Rainbow is how seriously they take field engineering experience. They aren't there just to write a bunch of detached rules about how things should work in the abstract and then let project developers figure it out. No, they are very serious about field engineering, about how operations actually work in the real world, and they take a rigorous yet philosophical approach. I'll link to those articles in the show notes in the sponsors section. You should check them out because it will give you a very good idea of why I think Rainbow is a very cool company and one that you should consider doing business with. If you are a project developer and you're thinking about which registry to use for your next project, you should absolutely take a meeting with Rainbow and see if there's a fit there. One thing to keep in mind that is often very important to the project developers that I've interviewed as a result of my work with Rainbow, doing customer discovery work, just trying to wrap my head around the opportunities that they're seeing, is how fast their certification process is. They typically quote around 3 months to issue carbon credits, which is very short. It goes by lickety-split for registries. So if you're a project developer, you're looking for a registry to use to certify and issue your carbon credits, take a look at Rainbow. Links in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening. I'd also love to tell you about Philip Lee LLP. If you've been working in this space for really any amount of time, you probably have noticed that you do need competent counsel to do business here. The contracts that get signed are frankly pretty weird. You're going to need help from a lawyer with a red pen. I'm sorry to inform you, your only choice is basically who they should be. And if you are deciding who they should be, you should be considering Philip Lee LLP. They've won Environmental Finance's VCM Law Firm of the Year for the last, since 2023, essentially. It hasn't happened yet for 2026. I imagine they're a contender for it this year as well. They are the largest legal team dedicated to the financing and development of carbon projects globally, and they have offices in the US, Europe, and the UK. One cool new thing I just learned, actually, is that they have been listed as a firm in Chambers Global as a global market leader in the area of climate change. This listing aligns Philip Lee LLP with around 15 to 20 of the leading law firms practicing in this practice area in the entire world. So congrats to Philip Lee LLP. Thank you to both Rainbow and Philip Lee LLP for your generous support of the show. You make it possible for me to dedicate so much time to putting out content that I hope is useful to our friends and peers and fellow travelers in the world of carbon removal, climate change, and carbon markets. Thanks so much. Here's the show. Hey out there, thank you so much for listening. This is Ross Kenyon. I'm the host of the Reversing Climate Change podcast, which is the show you're listening to right at this very moment. Before the show starts, if I could ask you please for a very small favor, what I hope is a very small favor, if you could please open up your podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever you use, give the show a full rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's 5 stars. If your podcast app has reviews, if you could leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts or whatever else you use that does reviews, it's really helpful. It helps more people find the show. And if you like this show, presumably you'd like it if more people listen to it. If I could ask you to please do that, it would be so appreciated. You can also become a paid subscriber on Substack or on Spotify for $5 a month. You can get ad-free listening, except for the ads that I read myself, and bonus content for subscribers only. I haven't fully set it up on Substack or on the other platforms, but I really should. Stay tuned on that. I'm going to try and get that set up. I already recorded a version of this show, and I try to listen to my gut, actually, as much as I can. And that day, I just felt like I wasn't quite getting it, and I wanted to make sure that I could give you the show that I think this topic deserves. And I think it's a hard topic to do well because there's a tendency to overdo it and include way too much information. And I also don't want to include too little information and seem cavalier. Today, I'm going to be making a bearish case for carbon removal. What might lead to carbon removal coming apart at the seams in the world to come? And just so I can say it as clearly as possible, I do not like playing this role. If you know me, I love to help people. I love relating to people. I love trying to make sure that everything gets to where it needs to be. I'm not trying to steal all the glory for myself or to spend a lot of time gatekeeping. I'm really trying to move this forward because I think climate change is a team sport, as the cliche goes. And one thing about not being tied to a specific company in a full-time capacity is I'm able to really focus on an ecosystem building kind of capacity. If you're at a company and you know that there's a party line that you must toe, because there often is, maybe I can give voice to some of those feelings and intuitions and intellectual observances that maybe you've had but haven't felt super safe voicing, whether to others or even to yourself. Because many of the things that I'm going to talk about today are threatening to the self and your life plans and your ability to pay your mortgage and to have a career that is not as turbulent as maybe your spouse might like it to be. One of the foundational assumptions of carbon removal, to the point that it's become a bit of a cliche, is what I call the pre-compliance story. Whether you call it this or you call it something else, or maybe you haven't even named it, you've certainly heard it, which is that the voluntary carbon market purchases and the big corporate offtakes you see are necessary but not sufficient, that we are basically waiting for compliance to automate demand, to obligate demand, and we're all waiting for the biting point to arrive. We are waiting for compliance to make sure that climate policy is taken seriously enough that we are able to hit the climate targets we need to not send the world into a desperate overshoot scenario. And the most recent version of this that you may have heard, maybe you've said it yourself, and maybe you believe it, and I really do hope that you are correct and that we are still on the trajectory to be in a pre-compliance moment. Okay, the United States has pulled out of the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has torpedoed, for lack of a better word, the International Maritime Organization's deal to regulate international shipping. It's pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but that's not as big of a deal as it maybe looks, because China is still leading the clean energy revolution. And moreover, the policy environment in Japan, Canada, the EU, specific member states within the European Union are going to carry the day with climate policy. And so no need to panic. There's still going to be enough support here to make sure that carbon removal can scale in the years ahead. I do not think this story is true. I want it to be desperately. I do not like playing this role, but I've been studying this in watching the politics and the geopolitics and the international relations and the trends in various electorates, especially since the start of 2025. And I keep waiting for the high water mark to be visible to me. And I can't say that I've seen it yet. And that was even before the conflict with Iran. And I had recorded essentially an entire podcast on this topic that I decided to scrap. And then this had come along. But I actually think Iran doesn't pose that big of a challenge to the core ideas I'm going to discuss. What concerns me about the pre-compliance story is that I think in a post-Trump 2 world, the three countries or network of countries that I mentioned earlier all have had substantial electoral changes since that pre-compliance story was written. Japan elected Sanae Takaichi of the Liberal Democratic Party. Her party picked up a whole bunch of seats in the National Diet of Japan, their legislative body. Admittedly, I know the least about her politics and how Japan operates, but she seems to be quite focused on energy security for Japan and is focused on defense. Those things compete with decarbonization. They don't have to, but they often do. And coming from the right, they are likely not seen as complementary, I think, or maybe not as much as we might like. Canada is a place where Poilievre of the Conservative Party was projected to win over Carney by double-digit figures and only began to lose because of Trump's 51st state talk. The 51st state talk really caused problems for Maple MAGA. This 51st state talk really makes me think because it's one of those things where it's an own goal in one sense. It probably would have been much better for Trump to have a MAGA or MAGA-esque candidate in Canada as the prime minister. And surely he had advisors saying, knock off all the 51st state talk and all this Greenland stuff because it's freaking out the Canadian electorate. You're going to put someone in power in Canada that you really don't want. If that advice was given, it doesn't seem to have been heeded, which actually concerns me because it makes it seem like that 51st state talk was genuine. There wasn't some blustery near-term political advantage to it. In fact, it seemed to have caused political problems more than political solutions. It's not like Canada as the 51st state was a core issue for MAGA that Trump hitting on was rallying the base in some way. It just felt like, where is this coming from? Which struck me as more than likely to be a sincere desire, which is scary. Like most of the Canadians I know, they took that 51st state talk very seriously, and it seems that Mark Carney has as well. And even though Mark Carney famously has a long background in carbon markets, he's also in a position now of trying to cut trade deals. Canada has very high cost of living and has to focus on militarizing in a way that is genuinely new for it. And all of those things compete with things like climate action. He also has to contend with Albertan secessionists who potentially want to join the U.S. or maybe want to just be independent of Canada and the U.S., but certainly will have more affinity with Trump than with the Trudeau-Carney sort of orbit. I think Canada will continue to be a climate leader, but I'm also very aware of the fact that Canada is going to face many more challenges in the future. One of the big geopolitical questions I have for the future is, does it help a country to be in the Arctic, or does it make it more vulnerable? One of the stories around why climate change may not be so bad in the future deals with the Arctic and says that this will make shipping routes much faster around the world. It will open up access to many more types of natural resources, and this will be a really good thing. But I think it's very likely that we will see intense security competition and potentially even war in the Arctic during our lifetimes. I guess it depends on how old you are right now at the time of listening for your lifetime, but I think that's a very real possibility. And while Canada will certainly benefit in many ways, it also exposes it to a great deal of risk. Its internal politics also are not uniform and are not uniformly oriented towards climate policy, as we saw from how the last election went. And I do not feel confident that Canada has a permanently durable climate politics in it. The electoral competition may show that Canada has more pressing and urgent problems than climate. They need to make sure that they have security. They need to make sure that the Arctic is protected. There are things that they need to be looking out for. And obviously, many of those things do overlap with climate. But people are not choosing climate policy in a vacuum. Politicians whose jobs are always up for being called back and replaced are trying to figure out how to balance climate politics versus more kitchen table issues like cost of living and are we safe from our neighbors kinds of questions. And those other questions, in a sort of basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs way, are going to ring much more powerfully. If you're having a hard time buying enough groceries for your family or feeling like you can't get ahead in this economy, it's really hard to think about how bad the world is going to be in several decades if we can't make sure we're hitting our climate targets and sacrificing right now. There are ways of making that pain less, ways of doing more with less that actually make our lives better. But in many cases, addressing climate change will require higher taxes or just the opportunity cost of investing in climate technology rather than more quotidian issues that voters care about. I don't feel like we can look to Canada as always going to be a place of climate policy refuge that we had maybe hoped it would be. I hope that is the case for the future. I think Canada has durable institutions, but it also faces political pressures that essentially the entire world is experiencing right now. And that brings me to Europe and the European Union in particular. I think it's safe to say that within carbon removal, the EU has the most hope placed upon it. Everyone is looking towards Europe with the hope that various things like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, or the EU ETS, the emissions trading system, or direct procurement by various states like Germany are going to have for carbon removal. There's talk of the Buyers Club, and there's various other acronyms of European policy that, depending upon your preferred type of carbon removal, offer various types of supports. I have a hard time imagining a near future where Europe will be able to advance significant climate policy. Even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the EU ETS be criticized by mayors in Germany and others who are not big fans. But one thing I'm looking towards closely, and granted, I'm an American, and I'm not living in these places and swimming in the same political culture as Europeans are, but I still try to track pretty closely what's happening in Europe for various reasons. And quite a lot of what I am seeing is the growth of right-wing populism in the same way that we're seeing essentially everywhere. The National Rally in France is projected to have a very good year plus. Friedrich Merz in Germany is a Christian Democrat and right of center, but I think a lot of older school center-right politicians face some pretty significant electoral challenges, especially with the growth of AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. In Germany, right-wing populists just have a more aggressive story that it's hard to, if you're an American, think about how different MAGA feels from Ronald Reagan or even Bush Sr. and Bush Jr., or even some of how Bill Clinton spoke, because Bill Clinton, of course, as a quote-unquote new Democrat, the idea was very much that we're going to balance the budget and we're not going to spend and focus on giving welfare, but we actually need to be fiscally conservative in a way that you wouldn't associate with someone like LBJ or FDR. It has a stately, tweedy, older school vibe to it. I think that's even more pronounced if you look to the UK and you think about how the Tories are doing relative to reform. I've mentioned this elsewhere that when I was a kid, the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, when I was younger, I remember hearing about Nigel Farage. And then now, 20 years later, you're seeing how Reform, the party that Nigel Farage is a part of now, the growth of them has been absolutely staggering. And I think Tories are really struggling to figure out what their story is, because there's always a funny kind of strange bedfellows vibe with right-wing politics where there often are working class, traditional values kinds of voters and people, but then certain types of conservative thought is extremely intellectual. Think of someone like William F. Buckley as sort of an archetypal, tweedy, conservative type. You know, the average working class person, I don't think they're looking to William F. Buckley and thinking like, this is the guy I want to listen to. But they do want to listen to someone like Trump, who sort of has this pugilistic, non-philosophical, not talking about Aristotle or looking back in time to English institutions and how important it is. Magna Carta is. It's more about kitchen table issues and the culture war and things like that I think the more stately types of conservatives are very poorly suited to win in a debate with. And you're seeing this happen where statelier, older school conservatives don't have as good of a story to compete with more radical right-wing candidates. So you are seeing around the world right now much more radical right-wing governments ascend. It would divert from the show to go into why this is happening and why now. And there are still a number of theories for how this is working. A fair amount of the causality belongs to how the internet operates and is monetized in the political economy of the internet. I'll leave that to someone else who studied this more closely. All we need to know, though, is that right-wing populism is a very, very dangerous trend for climate action. And when people point to places like the EU as a bastion of climate policy that will survive, even though the US has pulled out of essentially all of the major climate policy frameworks internationally, even if there are still some, very good things happening inside of the US that have lingered on even within Trump too. I think the thing to watch out for here is that Europe is projecting low growth rates. In the show that I recorded previously, I had heard that Europe was poised for an average of 1% growth rates over 2026, which is pretty low. And that was before Iran and the cost of oil shot above $100 a barrel. That can only put more pressure on the European system. It changes the relationship of various European states to Russia, and those that are friendlier with Russia want to maintain their access to Russian gas. And even the US has relaxed restrictions on Russian energy to make sure that the war remains less controversial. Because obviously one of the main moves that Iran is doing and will continue to do is trying to make this experience as embarrassing for the US and as costly as possible by raising energy prices worldwide. It's one of those kitchen table issues that really focuses the mind of politicians, where they know that their voters are going to care a lot about their energy prices and whether they have a job and whether they get a raise, because whatever money that they were going to get has now gone into paying higher energy prices, which are already very high in Europe, is gone. Those kinds of issues can be very challenging for governments. And if you want an example, you don't even have to look that far. And you can think about the Gilets jaunes of France, who were protesting over a tax on gasoline. And you don't really want to encourage politics like that if you are aiming for stability and for climate action. And when there is just less breathing room with low economic growth, with higher energy prices, and with right-wing populists gaining in so many countries, I don't think there's going to be as much room for radical climate politics. Germany has carbon removal procurement in its sights. Do you think that's likely to survive if the AfD continues to grow in electoral support? My guess is probably not. People are looking towards the UK ETS. Is that likely to survive the growing ascendancy of reform? My guess is probably not. And one additional reason why this concerns me so much is that climate action basically only works if we all, or most of us, band together and say we're all going to restrict ourselves in the same kind of capacity. We are going to invest the money in decarbonization, invest in carbon removal, because that is how the world order is structured. And if we don't do this, we will be an outsider to what are seen as the most legitimate countries on earth, the most powerful, the most trustworthy, who are all making those sacrifices and looking askance at us when we fail to meet our obligations and are trying to do the thing that is for our collective well-being. But the US is world leader, and it's an open question to what degree the US wants to remain the world leader that it's been since the end of World War II versus change its status to something more like a regional, hemispheric hegemon. Open question. But if that were to play out, it's difficult for me to imagine European leaders arguing to their populations that even though the US is not pursuing climate action, the EU should still raise their own taxes, raise their own energy prices to enact meaningful climate action, Because climate action essentially only works if all or most of these economies are engaged in the transition. If major powers just sit it out, those other countries are making sacrifices that actually don't get us to the goal. Maybe it buys us a little time, but I think that's a really hard story to sell to voters. Going to your population and saying, your net worth went down this year, inflation went up, your earnings went down, energy prices are up, but we need to sacrifice, even though it's not going to stop climate change, we need to do it because it's just the right thing to do. I think that is an electorally losing strategy. I'm really sorry to say. I wish we were able to have a sort of symbolic, beautiful, sacrificing kind of moment where that could be successful. I would think it would take a lot of patience and maturity and character to do that. But I don't think that can happen, especially not at the scale necessary to do that, in the hopes that maybe the US gets it together and either at midterms or at the next administration. I'm really concerned that that's probably the way that it's going to go. None of those dynamics feel conducive to climate multilateralism, climate action for the world. It seems like those are really powerful headwinds. The zeitgeist is blowing into our face, and it's hard to imagine how we're going to come back out of that. Those are the biggest reasons why I'm personally bearish right now on the future of carbon removal. I don't think the pre-compliance story is going to hold unless the zeitgeist switches again. And it's possible that it does, but these trends are so global, and it doesn't seem like the momentum has petered out quite yet. And this doesn't even get into all of the stuff about Greenland playing so aggressively with one's allies in NATO and how dramatically that can reshape the world order. The behavior of the US around Greenland, it reminds me of someone who maybe wants their significant other to break up with them, but isn't willing to break up with them themselves, and so behaves badly in the hope that their significant other will dump them. That's kind of how that whole thing felt to me. I'm like, oh wow, you really don't care about doing this to NATO, huh? I feel like that's a really surprising thing to do. And I feel like something like NATO no longer existing in a transatlantic capacity, at least for the US, I think would be a major change to the world system. NATO's durability and even the European Union's durability is something that I think is a big open question. And none of it bodes well for climate policy. I think anything that's disruptive, anything that raises prices in this way is likely to make climate action more difficult. Because when people are concerned about security or the cost of living, more abstract, probabilistic, future-oriented threats recede. How could they not? You can try to make your climate policy focus on ways of addressing all of those things at the same time, and in fact, it's probably the smart thing to do. But there's just probably always going to be some amount of sacrifice and cost necessary that we will have to shoulder to deal with the world that we have created and are passing on to our children. Given the way electoral politics is changing around the world and the rise of right-wing populism, I don't think that we can depend upon Japan, Canada, and the European Union, and to a lesser extent, the United Kingdom, to carry us through climate policy. I hope that I'm wrong. I'm actually really sick of thinking these thoughts and saying them. I keep saying them in meetings. People ask me, what do I think about this? I'm like, this is where I'm at. And maybe I'm just going to send them this episode from now on, because I've been staring into this for a long time, and it's just not looking good from basically any angle. In fact, one of the famous lines that I think this is one of the best jokes of all time, I don't even actually know if it's true or not. It might just be apocryphal. but it's George Orwell's famous response to Joseph Stalin. Stalin is alleged to have said, if you want to make an omelet, you've got to break a few eggs. And George Orwell retorted, where's the omelet? And that's essentially how it feels to me right now. The world has been changing massively in the last year plus, and I'm looking for the omelet, and I cannot seem to find one. For climate, let alone on any other front, really. When I'm advising companies in carbon removal and climate tech broadly, I'm often put in a position to ask them if they would like advice based around continuity or discontinuity. Do we regress to the mean? Is this a temporary phase that we all pull back from and say, oh, that was a thing that we did for a while, but the US is still broadly on the track that it was previous, and that we just made a small detour and then we all came back to the liberal democratic order, and that's what we're going to commit to for the foreseeable future? Or are we entering a period of reshuffling when the world order is being reconfigured? And if you want the answer based around continuity, I can give you a pretty good sense of how to build a successful carbon removal company. But you need to keep inside of your probability distribution what you do when the world is fundamentally changed and does not regress to the mean. Whatever you're doing in climate, make sure you have some plans for how your company can be successful if the world does not go back to the way that we thought it was, because it may not. Hopefully that isn't too dour a message. Again, for the third or fourth time, I don't like being in this position. I like being helpful and optimistic. But I think it's really important, especially if you work on anything strategic, is you have a clear vision of what the world is doing and what the various inputs are. In hindsight, some of them will matter less than one thought they would, and I hope that this is the case for this podcast. But I think we all need to prepare for a future in which the pre-compliance story does not arrive on time, or maybe does not arrive at all. Thanks for listening.